as soon as my first one, so I really appreciate technical feedback. We've got a lot to cover. So first of all, thank you very, very, very much. I am recording it and dream one day of having a YouTube channel, but I hope that's okay with you. Thanks those who donated to some COVID-19 local causes in the arts, and those of you who want more details about the Butterfly Art Project or unemployed musicians, mainly singers from the township, do let me know. And as in most Culture Connects, I love feedback, constructive criticism, very welcome. I'm really grateful for Sanet, who is going to chat a couple of points, and also for Natasha, who is going to look at the comments. Natasha and Sanet have been involved in piloting this. So let's see. Manuscript. Just quick intro. So just to give you a flavour of what we're going to be covering, it's quite a lovely range of knowledge, from some slightly embarrassing facts on concrete I didn't know, but I think are pretty key, to looking at some quite complex political concepts as we finish. But I'll just give you a bit of background how it all started. It was the beginning of lockdown, and I did a newsletter on Maundy Thursday asking for some volunteers to help me, and it's when Natasha and Sanet came on board. And I wanted the research to dovetail with future tours. And there's one scheduled by Lisa, pictured here, about the unfinished freeways. And we're starting at Artscape. And Sanet thought she might be quite interested in researching that. And then that threw up a whole lot of other interesting architectural features, both here and overseas. And so this Zoom is the result of about 3 months work part-time. Little did we realise that lockdown would go on so long. What I was keen that these talks do is bring in people who certainly I generally haven't heard talk about things in Cape Town and Joburg. And I hope that once lockdown is alleviated, I'll still continue them so that we can all enjoy looking at things here with greater insight. I wrote to my old friend Catherine Croft, who is mad about concrete, and she's never been to Cape Town. So she said, could you find someone in Cape Town who can talk about the buildings? And so I was introduced by Guy Briggs, my husband, to Martin, who was the first chair at UDESA, which is the Urban Design South African Institute. And I find it quite ironic, but it's typical in lockdown. I've never actually met Martin, though he works 10 minutes away from me. And obviously I've known Catherine for decades. So the next, as you know, the next part, they're going to be leading. And the plan is to look at iconic, I hate using that word, major pieces of brutalist architecture in this country, and Martin's suggestion comparing those to exemplars in the UK. So that's next Thursday, same time, same place. And then the last one is looking at the hot cross bun, as Martin calls it, an artscape, and then finishing off with the Barbican. Really chuffed that Guy's aunt Annie is going to be talking briefly about what it's like to live in the Barbican. So let's launch in. What is brutalism? As I've realised, there are lots of definitions, but I like this one because it's quite clear and quantitative as opposed to being very qualitative. It's from the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. So just giving some examples, rough unfinished surfaces. So this tower no longer exists, but you can see here the rough unfinished surface. It's actually in poplar. It's Robin Hood block of flats, and Catherine Croft, who leads a charity called the 20th Century Society, tried to stop it being demolished. And on YouTube, you can see a video that they produced talking to residents who are happy living there. But it's being replaced by probably about 5 times as many flats. And then on next to it, you may recognize is the UCT Sports Centre, but again, you can see the rough unfinished surfaces. And apparently buildings on that part of the campus have to have a UCT finish. And we'll be covering this in further detail when we do it with the experts, Catherine and Martin. Varied and contrasting textures and materials. So if you can see here, the actual concrete is like planks of wood, and that's deliberately so. And I chose this National Theatre on the South Bank by Dennis Lasden because Catherine Croft remembers going as a child and she couldn't resist touching the walls, and that's when her love affair with concrete started. Then I had to include where I went to university in the mid-80s. I studied the history of art, which included architecture. And you can just see the extension of the Sainsbury building, which is by Lord Foster there. And then, so Dennis Lasden, again, he designed what we call the ziggurats, as you can see why. And unfortunately, my horse dresses weren't in the ziggurats, but some of my lucky friends were there, and they were great. So they're 20 years after they were built, and they still were really, really nice. Then this extraordinary image here is from Japan. Excuse my Japanese accent, or lack of it. The Nakagin Capsule Tower by Kisho Kurokwaya. And the 20th Century Society did a tour to Japan, and Sanet and I watched their Zoom on it, and they went in here, and you can see the interior, and it hasn't dated very well at all. Quite a flattering picture, but sort of the space age, modular, and to me it's typical. It's next to this big freeway, which we're familiar with in Cape Town. So chunky blocks, unusual shapes. Some of you may know Mary Bradbury, who is a regular culture connector. She's moved to Montreal. And I asked her if she'd been, she said she hadn't, but she said she'd like to know more. So she sent me this picture of one of the flats inside. But moving on now to Russia, where there are the most extraordinary examples of brutalism in the broadest sense. But I included this one because it's a theatre, and here, as you can see, the architecture has been reused for dramatic effect. I think this is my favourite. It's a library, as you can see, and some of you may recognise the name of the library. It's named after Audrey and Theodore Seuss, as in Dr. Seuss. And obviously the doctor made a lot of money from his children's books and bequested it to the university. And it had a refurb, and that's when it was renamed. Certainly somewhere I'd love to go. Some of you may have been to this one. I love the way Ikea is jumping on the very modernist look. So just sort of thinking of the characteristics, brutalist architecture is characterized by a sense of mass, weight, and scale. Now this one I have seen, and I know some of you would have been to Boston Again,
Boston.
loved and loathed by some upside down wedding cake, it's been called. It was an international design competition in '62. And was actually constructed from '63 to '68. It opened in '68. I wanted to include something from Buenos Aires. I mean, I could have picked any country, and there'd have been a fabulous example of brutalism. This has an interesting story. It's where Eva Perón lived, and it was politically motivated to destroy the palace where she lived, and it was demolished in 1958 for this. Design was in '61, and construction started 10 years later, and it was only inaugurated in '92. That often seems to be a pattern, things take longer. I love this one. Apparently it was inspired Star Wars. A lot of Star Wars was filmed in Tunisia. It was quite glamorous in its day. James Brown stayed here. It could be demolished. It was sold in 2011 by the government to the Libyan government. So it's currently empty. Watch this space. The Whitney, well, not the Whitney anymore, it's MoMA. This illustrates to me beautifully small windows and the unusual shapes and concrete. Now, believe it or not, this was probably the most influential structure. It was a competition again, and a student won it. It was for a school in Norfolk, Hunstanton, in 1950. And this was the couple who won it. Alison was still a student, and it catapulted her career. Peter was only 26. In fact, he was Alison's teacher, and they married when she was 21. And he'd worked in the schools division of London County Council's Architects Department. And consequently, they set up their own practice. One of the reasons it took so long to build was that the county council had a problem getting steel. And so Norfolk's entire allocation of steel it was still rationing, and that's something I really want to emphasize, how to picture the time post-war really was austerity, and how a lot of brutalism was a glimpse into the future, something different. And funnily enough, it was called New Brutalism. Peter said that Alison coined the word when she was on the loo. Some say it was a pun on Peter's student nickname of Brutus. But it really came from béton brut, excuse my non-existent French accent, which meant raw concrete. But when we talk about coining this new word, we have to mention this character, Rainer Banham. He wrote a book that became very authoritative. He studied art history at the Unisco rival Courtauld Institute, and he likened this new look to the equivalent to what happened with Cubism and Fauvism, this avant-garde art movement, how radical it was. As you can see, it's actually probably first published by a Swedish architect. But one of the points I want to make is I don't want to get too hung up with nomenclature, with words, and with labeling certain buildings and certain styles. I think the British have a bit of a bad reputation for trying to label everything. But I talked about what went before And I wanted to emphasize, it's difficult to think of it now, how depressed England was and how monotonous its vernacular was. So there's the rise of the semi-detached. So you can really see how revolutionary Brutalism was and how it didn't really have many takers to start with. But something that the Smithsons emphasized was that they were keen to look at natural materials. They didn't just want to use concrete. And you may remember the RIBA definition. Concrete didn't actually come up. I had to include Lloyd Wright here. This is his Imperial Hotel in Japan, and then the use of nature. But really, Corbusier has the best press when it comes to being a forefather of Brutalism and modernism. I deliberately chose this shot of him because he relied on so many others, but he was quite a good publicist. And so he took a lot of the stardom for himself. I also like this picture because they're all wearing bow ties, and you can see that comes up quite a lot. But many of you are familiar with particularly the chapel, which had all the hallmarks of Brutalism, in the sense there were the arches and the quite random windows you might remember from the New York, now MoMA building. These are two houses. It's in Paris. They were designed by Corb and built in 1954. And some people say that both these two projects were his most important post-war buildings, and sort of introduced this rugged aesthetic of unpainted cast concrete or béton brut. Moving on now to the really big influencer is Unité de Habitation in Marseilles. So I think this is very useful in terms of understanding the possibilities that Brutalism gave, and how concrete could be used expressively. I particularly like the image on the right because it's got colour. So there are giant columns, and the whole building looks like they're based on these columns, pilotis, and each flat with maisonettes. It's got this lovely coloured frame, and then as you could, I mean, this is really quite something. But I've seen lots of other pictures that make it look terribly dull. But he loved the fact that concrete, when it was cast, could still have a rawness to it. And he got very frustrated with the workmen on it. The carpenters did the shuttering, and the concreters. They were used to the defaults in concrete being made good, plastered or painted. And he wanted the blemishes to be seen. And this caused a radical rethink on concrete's aesthetic. Some of you may know particularly this bottom building here. Guy always gets excited about it when we go from the centre of London to Heathrow. It's the Trellick Tower. I think it's waned and waxed in popularity, had huge social problems, had facelifts, and it's a listed building now. But here he is with his wife. He actually, you can read, lived in the tower here to find out from residents what it was like. And in fact, the James Bond film Goldfinger was based on, I don't know, was a Hungarian emigre and his name, and daunting character, seemed appropriate for a James Bond villain. I thought it's important to do a quick recap on concrete. And it's quite hard finding a good definition, but Catherine Croft came up with this one at the top. Some people say it was invented by the Romans, but as she says in her book, in fact, their concrete was very different to the concrete we know at the moment. It was in fact being used early mid-19th century in Paris for a cheap building material, but still stone was considered a thing to do. Concrete was fine for the cheap buildings. So that some English engineers and manufacturers really took it to its next level, Portland cement. But it was the Germans and the French who made it so it could be used for large spaces. And now, a lot to thank for. It's very flexible, versatile, and relatively cheap. And it can even be used in art. So I just put Rachel Whiteread's concrete sculpture. She did this in the mid-1990s. And it was after one of the concrete high-rise buildings off the Mile End in East London had been demolished. But it has a poignancy. But going back to our Brutalist story, I just wanted to mention this Italian, Nervi, who I have to confess I never had heard of before this journey. But he was the engineer stroke architect of the Good Hope Centre. And Sanet did a lot of research on him, came up with these rather lovely pictures. Before I hand over to her to talk a bit more about Nervi, I want to say in the Second World War, concrete came into its own in that it could be used for aircraft hangars here. It could be used for, obviously, defense, air raid shelters. So when you see this hangar in Italy, Orvieto, it was quite revolutionary to be so beautiful, because the war period, it was still very much functional. Sanet, do you want to quickly talk about Nervi?
Sure, 100%. So Nervi, what was interesting about him is that he was actually an engineer and not an architect. He never actually qualified as an architect, but he had a passion for design. So throughout his life, he was he sort of straddled both of those disciplines. He actually started quite a way before some of the others. He was sort of a forerunner to Brutalism, as I see it. He did all sorts of interesting things. During the Second World War, for instance, he designed some vessels. He tried to design vessels for the Italian army, which never really came to fruition. But he constructed quite a few sailing boats and things like that. Now, those Turin esplosioni, excuse my pronunciation, yes, that was done with what he invented. It's a process he invented called ferrocemento, which was composed of dense concrete, heavily reinforced with evenly distributed steel mesh, which gave it lightness and strength. And that's how he managed to do these massive hangars, which he won which he managed to construct. He won the national competition to construct these vaults with huge spans. And what he did as well is he used prefabricated structural components, which made it easier to do those massive expansions. You can also see that on the inside of our Good Hope Centre. And I don't know how familiar people are with that, but it's also got those vaults along the ceiling. He built a lot of things in France. He was a foremost architect there, in Italy. He built stadiums after the war. He built the Papal Audience Hall, exhibition halls at the 1960 Olympics, and he collaborated with Marcel Breuer on the UNESCO headquarters. He built the George Washington bus terminal in New York, and he designed the St. Mary's Cathedral in San Francisco. I'm not sure if we have a picture of that.
Yeah, we do later.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting one. The Italian embassy in Brazil, the Australia Tower in Sydney. So he worked extensively throughout the world for quite a long time, together with his two sons, I think, also here in South Africa. And then I think I just can say finally that his work is described as sort of entering the realm of poetry. He was appointed by Harvard to the Charles Eliot Norton Chair of Poetry in 1961, which is quite interesting for an architect, I think. Yeah,
great.
I think that's...
Thank you. Has anyone got any questions at this stage? We're nearly halfway through. Or should I just race on and we can chat at the end? Okay, so moving on to the next chapter about how the aesthetic qualities of concrete really turned a huge corner. I wanted to include Louis Kahn because some South African architects studied underneath him in Pennsylvania. They studied in Cape Town, Wits, Pretoria, and then would do their postgrad overseas. And I thought that these two pictures are good because you can actually see how he wanted, how the concrete slabs are made. So both in the interior and the exterior, you can see it was like a record of the casting process. This is the Skull Institute. Now, moving on to South America, Brasilia. We could have gone to India, but I thought given the links that come back to South Africa, it'd be good to look at this phenomenal brutalist exponent. So Niemeyer, he was a legend. He died when he was 104, and some of you may have met him. As you can see, Brazil didn't have the steel necessary for building big expanses, so they really pushed concrete technically. And Corbusier actually visited Niemeyer in 1929 and 1936. And this architecture was to express, a brave new Brazil, a Brazil without colonial legacy, without Baroque, and without classical architecture. Brasilia was meant to not have any slums, but I think it does now. People who've been there say it feels like an office campus. There's no street life. It was the age of airplane travel, and apparently looking down at Brasilia, there's an outline of an airplane. So Niemeyer didn't do the urban design; he was the architect. And he had one child, Anna Niemeyer, who worked with him quite closely and a lot of the interiors. This was the first main building to be complete, the President's Palace. And Niemeyer, he came into quite a lot of criticism. And he countered that by saying, I've done it. Nobody's perfect. There's always good and bad. Just to quote him, if you go to see Brasilia, the important thing is this. You may or you may not like the buildings, but you can never say you'd seen something similar before. Those fine columns, the buildings like feathers touching the ground, all that creates an effect of surprise. So wait till you see the next slide, talking of surprises. Joburg. I want you to look here, and I'm going to flick back to here. And it's an obvious influence. This was one of the most important civic commissions of the period. The architect went to Zeitz, and this was only shortly afterwards. I don't know, Judith, do you want to say anything about this, other than that you can get lost in it? So I just want to explain a bit about this connection between Brasilia and Gauteng. What was key influence was an exhibition actually in New York in '43. And it was also when Pretoria University had its first School of Architecture. And I think the ethos of Brutalism, it sort of resonated with young architects. It was sort of a newly independent statehood, and also would resonate with their clients, the government. There are obviously more and more publications that people could get hold of. There were bilateral links between the South African and the Brazilian Institute. Then I loved this phrase by Nicholas Pesner. Some of you may know Nicholas Pesner. He wrote very influential books about the story of architecture. And he didn't really like Brutalism, I have to say. But he commented when he was here in '53 about the existence of a little Brazil in the Commonwealth. You can see him here giving a Reed lecture. So it wasn't just the state buildings that were influenced by Brasilia, the Dutch Reformed Church too. I love these churches. They surprised me, particularly those small Karoo landscapes. You see the spires jutting up. This is the Cathedral, Brasilia. Again, fabulous shapes, sculptural, adventurous, prison-like. This is moving on now to the Northwest University, as it's now called, and you can see the raised long horizontal block, mosaic-clad pilotis, and the raw concrete roof. It's a sculptural tour de force in the Brazilian idiom. There's a really good new book that has a chapter by Frederico Freschi. It's called Troubling Images. And in fact, Frederico is going to be doing a Culture Connect next month. He's now based in university in New Zealand, so I have to be at 9:30 in the morning. But I worried about this building here, whether I'd got it right, but that is actually how it is. Then Stellenbosch, lots of examples of this modernism, this brutalism that, again, we'll cover in a separate Culture Connect, hopefully going to visit. But this idea that you could create a national identity through harnessing the new. This says it all here, really. At the time, South Africa had great prosperity, which obviously meant that they could fund new and amazing buildings. But it resonated with the government, like, we are progressive, we are new. We can be modern, we can be sophisticated. Sanet, over to you to talk quickly about Ponte, the first cylindrical skyscraper.
Right. So Ponte is in Johannesburg. It's in Hillbrow. And it was completed in 1975. Architects were Manny Feldman, Manfred Hermer, and Groskopf. It was an upper-class building in the 80s. Well, no, it was upper-class between the 70s and the 80s. And then, unfortunately, the upper-class inhabitants moved out of the city, and it became an urban vertical slum for quite a long time, and it had a really bad reputation. Then it was refurbished 2008 to 2012, and it's come full circle. It's now gentrified and chic again, and a lot of people like living there. It was the first cylindrical skyscraper in Africa, and it's very high. It's 55 floors and 173 meters high. And that Vodacom sign that you see at the top used to be the Coca-Cola sign. And at the time, it was the largest sign in the Southern Hemisphere. I'm not sure if that's still so. I think that was before 2000. Then Vodacom took over. Over to you, Kate.
Well, I just thought it'd be good if you chatted about where you went to university.
Yes. So UJ, that's where I studied history of art in the mid-80s, same as you, Kate, in the UK. And at the time, I must say, I didn't appreciate it as a brutalist building. I just found it really cold and forbidding in those Joburg winters, and having to walk from one end to the other. You know, the canteen was one end, and the history of art building was right the other end. So it was lots of walking on these hard floors. But I do appreciate it now. And I can see that it was quite a monument to brutalism. It was designed by W.O. Meyer and Partners and Van Wyk and Partners. And Meyer had done a postgraduate masterclass under Louis Kahn at the University of Pennsylvania before he returned to South Africa to complete this in 1975. So quite a strong influence by Louis Kahn there. And I might just add that this was the first Afrikaans university in Johannesburg, the only one. And it was called the Rand Afrikaans University at the time. Of course, now it's called UJ. But it was constructed during the era of apartheid. I have seen recent photos of it. It's not easy to get in there if you're not a student. But I think they've tried to add a bit more color and make it a bit warmer than it was when it was built. But yeah, it still stands in a good example, I would say.
Great, thank you. Someone's just trying to get on, Sanet. I don't mind. Would you mind just quickly talking about this while I send them the link?
The Group Areas Act.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think I recognize the picture on the right. I think that was the black sash.
Yeah.
When they tried to the opening night of Artscape, because it was a whites-only building and there was a lot of objections to that. So the black sash protested, I think, 100 or 200 meters away from opening night. And I think there were also students who were distributing leaflets on the night. And people like Chris Barnard were very anti-apartheid and said he would never set foot in there, of course. So quite a lot of prominent people were opposed to this, but yet those laws persisted. As you can see in the middle, white persons only, totally ridiculous. In terms of Artscape, I think they managed for 10 years to keep it going, and then it was dropped, and it allowed persons of color to both attend and entertain. I'm not sure what that picture on the left is, Kate, but I don't know if that's also black sash.
Yeah, that's all about the protest.
Yeah, lots of protests. Eventually they had to bow to the protests.
It's definitely also black sash.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
that's also
that's right. Black sash.
They did amazing work.
I guess why I wanted to put this in, because as you may have gathered, a lot of the impetus for Brutalism came from this social ideal, like this, fantastic new modern homes after the slums, state-of-the-art architecture for state schools in England. And in South Africa, a lot of the failures came with Brutalist architects because the architects had something in mind and their clients didn't. So with the Verdmuller Centre, the architect there, he wanted it to be a place for local people to go who couldn't afford to go to Cavendish, down the opposite. But then if you weren't white, you were moved out of the area. So commercially it was bound to fail. And it's in the artscape, no expense spared, left a horrible taste in a lot of people's mouths, and they wouldn't go there because it was for whites only. And this leads on to another side of Brutalism. The day it sort of fell out of fashion, and some people say it's still fallen out of fashion, but it makes the most wonderful film sets. Clockwork Orange, dystopian utopias, image here. And then some of you may recognize the Good Hope Centre in Cape Town too. It's been let out to film studios the past 4 years, though currently it's earmarked to be a field hospital in case the CTICC can't cope as a temporary hospital for COVID-19. And in fact, upset a lot of the local community who wanted it still to be a public building where they could go for their Eisteddfods, go for their boxing competitions and things. But we're going to cover that later, as you know, in another series. And then this is Verdmuller Centre, and it's the scriptwriter, and it was for Lake Placid Legacy, which some of you may have seen. It's a 2018 American-South African horror film. So Brutalism became a very good setting for horrors. Concrete can be very unforgiving, and it's not like something that's painted and you put a lick on paint on and it's fine. That's the way you maintain it. Catherine Cross actually teaches on concrete conservation, and I think a lot of local authorities and clients, commercial clients particularly, they cut corners. So often these innovative buildings are not particularly happy at the moment. But there starts to be a bit of a change in the attitude towards Brutalism. And Jonathan Mendes, he did a documentary in 2014. And I rather liked his way of looking at it. And I chose this Brunel University picture here, which he included in his documentary that you can access on YouTube. Because Brutalism, of course, would never have happened without engineers, the daringness, the advances in technology. And universities like Leeds still have departments focused on the next stage of concrete's development. So this picture of Elaine here, she's got a character. She's also done a very good book on Art Nouveau, which amuses me. So she said by the time her Brutalist book was published, Brutalism was almost a cliche. And she tried to understand why some people now loved it. And she felt perhaps because it was so adventurous and creative, and also some of the iconic buildings were being demolished. People were sad about that. In the next series, we'll show some of those buildings. And I guess as a harking back to the 60s and 70s. During this time of a bit of a revival, Dr. Foyle talked about brutalism being like the medieval periods, which I did a bit of a double take about. But the way they focus on the interior, and why I wanted to include this quote here is because I don't think one should get too hung up about labels in architecture. I mentioned this earlier. So some of you may recognize this as St. George's in Cape Town by Herbert Baker. Some people might call it Edwardian, some people might call it Neo-Gothic, some people might call it Romanesque. The fact is, it's an amazing space. And in fact, Catherine Croft is very open about what you can call brutal architecture and what you can't. And apparently Sir Dennis Lasdon did not like to be called a brutalist architect. He said he wasn't, but in everything I read, the South Bank, the National Theatre, UEA, they're definitely classified as brutalist architecture. So just charting again, this Renaissance is probably a bit of a strong word, and it's probably one reason why I'm doing this talk, because I'm too part of this rethinking. I think it's a bit of a Marmite type of architecture. You love it or you loathe it. And the people who seem to love it the most are those who have studied architecture. And so there's a very active SOS Brutalism. They've got a fantastic website that has nearly 2,000 brutalist buildings. And being German is kept up to date and is very easy to use. And there are 7 buildings in South Africa that are on this database, not all endangered. And I put a picture too that we haven't covered. This is PE, and it does remind me a bit of being at UEA, the way that we could walk around outside and the flat roofs. But this rather lovely house in Pretoria, House Juice. So I just want to finish off, 10 to 2, with looking at this new brutalist aesthetic. Sanet, I know you know more about the water tower than I do.
Well, I think a lot of what you've said, I can't add very much to that. It was created the SAIA Award of Merit in 1997. The creators referred to it as an urban sculpture, or a spiral tornado-like form, which I think is quite nice. A lot of people see it as a sort of a statue in a way, an art form. It's interesting that the water, which fills the top part, that part is used, but the middle bottom part, which is actually conference facilities and restaurant, museum facilities, and should have amazing views, is not used at the moment. Commercial areas are vacant. They're only using the top part for some reason. I think the Gautrain runs past it at the moment. So yeah, it's beautiful, I think.
Okay, so just finishing off with another stunner. I'm sure this doesn't need any introduction at all. And I'm not sure you can strictly say this is a brutalist icon, but it has some of the characteristics, and of course uses a lot of concrete. And in my research, I was thrilled to find quotes by Walter Gropius, who is a sort of forefather of brutalism, a great modernist architect, very influential. As you can see, the quote says there. And then Corbusier also thought grain silos were fantastic. And I think Zeitz MOCAA is fantastic. And while it was designed by a Brit, Thomas Heatherwick, it was local talent, Sutherland's engineers, couple of architectural practices who realised it, because there's obviously quite something cutting through 42 old grain silos. So silos that were built in the 1950s, obviously never designed to be an art gallery, to be cut through to create that phenomenal atrium. I'm secretly hoping this will persuade Catherine Croft to come and visit Cape Town and bring the 20th Century Society here. So just finishing off, whet your appetite. There's a whole host of things you can get on social media. This is a picture, by the way, taken by Annie Wingate last weekend at the Southbank Centre in London. And this rather nice installation is a campaign to keep performances live. Then David Adjaye, he's done a video, which I confess I haven't seen. And I've got Oliver, my son, to watch a few of them with me. And do let me know if you'd like this this list. The current Visi magazine, not the online one, but the one that you get at the newsstands and deliver to your door, has a big feature on Brutalist current architecture. So just to finish off, while Brutalist architecture is phenomenal, it still has its supporters, its fan club, and those that can't stand it. I think whatever your personal opinions of the aesthetic, I think it's helpful. Well, certainly it's for me, if I think about how important it was to get architecture where it is today. So if you think about art and painting, what people had to do to break tradition to get to art where it is now, Brutalist had that impact. And we've got 6 minutes left, and I just want to thank you very much. Really appreciate you joining us. I'd love your feedback, both now and by email, how this can be improved. And it's fantastic. A lot of you signed on for Martin Kruger's and Catherine Cross talks next Thursday and the following one. And I'd like to end with this. So I've never ever been to, I'll kick myself, so I have San Francisco.
Amazing space.
Yeah, it is. And the way that Brutalism is truly international and could be adapted to most functions, including very spiritual spaces. So now I'd love to have comments. And if you've got to go find, just slip away.
Well, I mean, that's a copy of Kenzo Tange's one in Japan, which is a true brutalist. Well, I've been to the one in Japan.
And what was that like?
So that's why I said it's an amazing space. I mean, you know, you look at this heavy building, and then when you get in there, it's just so light, and you don't feel like it's concrete. You know, so
yeah, amazing. That's my spreadsheet. Anybody else got any comments?
Just well done, Kate. Good introduction. Well done. Very good.
Oh, thank you. It was just meant to be a precursor for next fortnight, so that when Martin Kruger and Catherine Croft are talking, we didn't have to go over some basics. It acts as a foundation. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to go into much details about the artists and the architects' lives, the engineers rather. And also Martin, he has a really interesting take on buildings. He also is an artist. he's taught, he's passionate about cities. So I think we'll get a flavour of these 10 buildings that we wouldn't get anywhere else. And I'd just be fascinated to see what Catherine says. I mean, we did a dummy run, so I've got a sense of her feelings of what's here. And it just confirms to me the rich architectural heritage and diversity of Cape Town.
Thanks, Kate. It was great.
Thanks, Kate. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Sabina, I was wondering if you had any comments. Hi, having worked at Zeitz MOCAA.
I was wondering, I mean, I'm not an architect and stuff, but I was, and hi, Richard, nice to see you. I was thinking, as you were, I wonder if the Zeitz MOCAA falls in that category. It felt like it, so yeah. I think, yeah, great space to see. I mean, lucky enough to see it unfold, obviously. I mean, what a privilege, you know. I found it always quite sad. I know the big reveal was an important part of the PR process, but I always found it quite sad that people couldn't watch the unfolding of it. To me,
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, well, we do have architecture students now. Well, up until lockdown, we had hundreds of architecture students pouring through on guided and self-guided tours, and so it's extending its influence.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is to watch the building being carved out and the whole process of it. That to me was a sad opportunity, but you know, whatever.
Yeah, I remember taking my students at Vega to go and see the 2010 stadium being built. It is an amazing experience. We do have documentation, and it is shown, and those YouTube videos are given there. But my understanding in a way is that something needs to be built as brutalist to be classified brutalist in a way. It was then inspired almost surrealistically by old Heatherwick with the influence of the seed and stuff. So he made it into a cathedral, and it became almost sort of Baroque, I don't know, something else. It's definitely a hybrid.
Yeah.
Well, don't forget, he made it into brutalism. What it was a defined elements, and by cutting through it and opening up all the windows and opening up the scale, he actually dramatically changed the whole scale of the building and its dynamics, and that became brutalistic. It wasn't before.
Understood.
Yeah. Richard works in education there, and he very sweetly sent me the link to that Soviet theatre. I'm interested in the Brinks. Hi. So if you just have breakfast, what's your takes? You must know some of the Boston, New York brutalists.
I have to admit, I've always hated the Boston City Hall, and along with it, the FBI building in Washington, D.C.
Awful.
Which may be one of the most hated buildings in the United States anyway.
Associated with J. Edgar Hoover, who was also hated. So, but this has given me a new appreciation, really a wonderful retrospect.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to coming back and seeing these.
Great. Yeah, I look forward to seeing you.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm tempted to also to go to the Dicer Towers, the Tampon Towers. I mean, they're not strictly brutalists, and I could tell Martin's face dropped when I mentioned it. I was amazed that Guy's never been there, but I will be doing a tour in due course.
Oh, I'm signed up for that for sure. I've always wanted to get into that.
Okay, good. We're spot on too. Any other comments before we close? Margot?
Well,
yeah. Sorry.
Nothing.
Anton?
Thanks. No comments. Thanks, Kate.
Okay, thanks.
See you. Thanks,
Okay,
Kate.
see you next week, everyone. Thanks again. Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Okay.